Afternoon and welcome to the first online debate of the Midpoint, supported by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung South Africa. Over the last year, we as Konrad Adenauer Stiftung realized that more and more South Africans are searching for something that one could call a third way or something a way in between. The Midpoint is trying to give those people a political home. One for people who are in favor of a market economy, but who also see the need for social assistance and empowerment due to the high levels of inequality and poverty in South Africa. Today, we will discuss the effects of COVID-19 on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Thank you for your attention, and I hand over to Marius.
Well, thank you, Henning. It's always wonderful to be with you, and thank you to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for making this conversation possible. What we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen, is hear from Ronak, who's going to share with us about his paper. We're then going to hear from Chapidi as a respondent, and then we look forward to your questions and comments, and we will facilitate an interactive discussion for the bulk of our time together. And so we look forward to you contributing to the conversation. And so with that, let me hand over to Ronak to kick us off, and then we'll move through the conversation from there.
It's a new era. We've all become baby Zoomers doing this kind of stuff online. It's a coronial era. And, it's a great reset to our political, economic, and institutional systems that we had come from. I think there are a few trends in particular that have started to emerge in the aftermath or during this pandemic. And the global liberal order in particular has come under particular scrutiny. I think the huge question marks around the future of globalization, the huge question marks around the future of capitalism, and the future of democracy. And in contrast to these, we're getting nationalist impulses, we're seeing authoritarian tendencies, and we're seeing greater protectionism. We've seen massive supply chain disruptions as a result of border closures, and a huge repudiation of the free movement of goods and people. Countries have become a lot more inward-looking, and this has posed a lot of existential questions around the future of free trade. For the African continent in particular, this is quite a conundrum, because as walls and divisions have been put up from the rest of the world, Africa has been trying to buck this trend and go in the opposite direction with an integration agenda. And the flagship initiative to underpin that has been the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was launched in Kigali in 2018. The pandemic has exposed the deficiencies of Africa's economic model. We are very reliant on single commodity exports, and we are therefore subject to boom and bust scenarios. And at the moment, we find ourselves, even though we've handled the healthcare fallout from the pandemic pretty well, navigating this trilemma of issues, namely debt, disease, and political dysfunction. With the pandemic, there have been questions around whether this is still going to happen as it was envisaged to. It's created a whole bunch of difficult challenges. They're not insurmountable, but they have created problems that need to be navigated. It's important to focus on why people have been getting excited about the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Number one is the size and the scale of the initiative. It is an economic free trade zone, which would be the biggest in the world, 1.2 billion people, an economy of the size of 2.5 trillion US dollars, 54 countries, and quite simply too big to ignore for any business and any entity looking to invest in Africa. Secondly, there was political momentum. For someone who's been looking at Africa for a long time, I think the speed at which these agreements have been reached and the agreement was both signed and ratified and came into legal force surprised me. I think, we've come to associate the AU and its various bodies as a slow, bureaucratic, cumbersome beast. However, this marked a very welcome departure from that. And lastly, and Henning, you've touched on this already, it was an African solution to an African problem. It presents a compelling value proposition for Africans to take control over their own destiny and build towards a future of shared prosperity. I think what's quite important is that, in my mind, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is needed now more than ever, because it can have a real catalytic effect on the African continent. When the pandemic hit, the policymakers and the technocrats who were running with this were faced with three key dilemmas. So delay, abort, or push on. The synchronized nature of this pandemic, the fact that financial markets and the real economy are both going to be affected simultaneously, and this is happening both in developed and developing markets, that means that there's very little external assistance that can be brought about. With very low revenue lines from its primary revenue earners and very weak tax collection, the debt issue and the prospect of defaults is something that we are going to need to watch quite closely. So with that in mind, it's quite clear that Africa can rely on no one besides itself, and we need these African solutions to African problems. Geopolitically, too, I think there's scope for significant growth over here. It's becoming quite clear that Africa needs to negotiate as a collective for its voice to be heard in global forums. Then the question becomes, what are the prospects of success? Discrepancies between the big states and the small states in the African continent and how that harmonization process works will be quite important. The smaller states will be reluctant to sign up if they feel that they're getting a raw deal or that they're not protected, given the fact that tariffs and protectionist measures are very much the only kind of revenues that they have coming in much of the time. The fact that South Africa has had frequent xenophobic attacks, the fact that Nigeria has closed its borders with Benin, the same issue with Tanzania and Zambia, and the fact that the United States and Kenya are looking to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement, all raise significant question marks around whether this is going to be a simple or straightforward process. And I think quite clearly the answer is no. For me, the direction of travel is still positive. I think we need to understand that this is aspirational in nature. There are going to be speed bumps along the way. But if we aim for the moon and we reach the stars, then I think we're still making progress. I think, for many countries, particularly the Eastern European countries, there's been a lot of success as a result of the European Union. But then, of course, we've got Brexit on the other hand. And I think the political integration and the economic integration offers lessons for the African continent in terms of putting the cart before the horse, because as we've seen from the PIGS crisis and the sovereign debt crisis involving Greece, Portugal, and these other countries, when productivity differentials are not addressed, they create larger systemic issues. I think in terms of NAFTA, we need to be wary about the dominance of one big country in a free trade agreement. And then if we looked at the failed free trade agreements of the Americas, I think that suffered from a real deficit of trust. The private sector was not on board. Average citizens were not on board, and it was overly ambitious, and it suffered from political dynamics. Looking ahead, there have been a number of significant hiccups, but I think not all hope is lost. I think we need to watch a few things quite closely in the next coming months. We need to be wary of a second wave of COVID-19 in Africa, which could really further setbacks. Create further setbacks. We need to watch Nigeria quite closely and to see whether it ratifies the agreement, because I think that will be a real boost and add huge gravitas and forward-looking momentum to the agreement. And then we need to look at the regional economic communities and their role as building blocks in terms of the broader integration strategy.
Ronak has really outlined some good points, right, as to why this can or cannot work. Like him, I'm an Afro-optimist. I've always been an Afro-optimist. And this is highly aspirational. But I've got some grave concerns as to, is this realistic? COVID pandemic has had some serious adverse impact on our economies. We've seen more of our economies under significant debt distress. But I think more importantly, it's really shown how undiversified our economies are and how we need to diversify economies. There's not a single economy over the past 30 years that has not known that we need to diversify away from commodity-driven economies. So the question for me is, and Ronak put it out, it's around leadership and it's around political will. And I'm not too sure that we've got enough of these, right? Nigeria still hasn't ratified and delivered the instruments for ratification. Nigeria, as one of the leading economies on the continent, one of the most populous economies on the continent, can we actually go ahead with a free trade agreement without one of the largest economies? Should Nigeria not be playing a leading role within West Africa, like a Kenya should be in East Africa and a South Africa should be in the Southern African context? So I think, to me, these are some of the critical things that we need to think about. But there are certain basic things that are not even in place. Infrastructure. How do we transport goods from one country to another? Border controls, getting things through customs. I know these are things that are going to be addressed, but basic infrastructure, delivery of electricity, delivery of roads, delivery of ports, all of these things need to be in place and need to be the foundation before this is going to take off. But I think more importantly, the lack of political will for me is what's concerning. There's a lot of change that's currently going on, several elections that are coming up, some of our leaders refusing to step down. These things also, to me, are really concerning as to who's actually going to be driving this when even the democratic institutions within our countries are being challenged.
The simple fact is that without Nigeria as a signatory, this agreement is dead in the water. Now, whether they're playing hardball or whether they are using it to negotiate, I think eventually they will come round, because as a big economy and as a dominant player in West Africa, they stand to benefit. So I think without that, there's no two ways about it. Without Nigeria, this thing is not gonna get lift off. With the regional integration blocks, many regional integration communities, many of which already have substantial integration, like the East African community, I think building on those already allows for greater integration into the wider project. We need to understand also that this needs to be done in phases, and your regional integration community is your first port of call, and will deal with a lot of the operational issues, dealing with customs officials, dealing with practical issues along the way. Now, we know that there are different levels of integration, different levels of commitment to free trade amongst all of these regional economic communities. But I think as starting points and as hubs, they're going to be very important. And it's important to understand that they're going to be complementary rather than competitive.
Accountability and governance are critical. If those pillars don't exist within this free trade agreement, then, as to use Ronak's term, we're dead in the water before we even start. And to me, it goes back to trust, right? With the requisite governance structures in place, it builds trust. It's critical that the agreement, there's transparency within the agreement. How the negotiations have happened, as Ronak has said earlier, the big countries versus the smaller players. How is it that we bring everybody along and make sure that this is a win-win solution for all?
I think the geopolitical chessboard is being completely rewritten at the moment. You have got changing dynamics all over the place. The architects of the global liberal order are now rejecting it. If you look at the way that the US and the UK are behaving at the moment with their protectionist impulses, China is now the champion of global trade, which is a bit mind-boggling. Then you've got Russia starting to flex its muscles on a global stage again. You've got the likes of Japan and India, who are also very interested in Africa. So there's an opportunity here from an African perspective to use all these development partners to extract the maximum benefit out of each of them, because they're all interested. I think that's going to be very important to play the economic diplomacy game really well. And this is where the Continental Free Trade Agreement becomes really important, because it gives us bargaining power. There's a vested interest, if you look at all parties across the world, in making sure that there's a prosperous Africa. From the European perspective, from a security and migration flow, which has been the priority in recent years. If Africa is suffering from economic depression, and there is going to be acute economic pressure, food insecurity, and the likes, Europe is the most obvious point of migration. And so a successful, prosperous Africa means that it's in Europe's interest, because it prevents that massive outflow and prevents this becoming a European. From the Chinese perspective, we know that China has been very active in Africa, involved in building infrastructure. To trade freely and effectively, we are going to need railways, roads effectively, and through the Belt and Road Initiative, I think this is something that can obviously add huge value in terms of increasing the connectivity towards Africa. What our continent, the policymakers need to be careful about is falling into debt trap diplomacy, which is where they borrow excessively and then they're unable to pay back, and then the allegation is that this is a new form of imperialism and colonialism. And in recent months, China has come under scrutiny for that because of the xenophobic attacks in Guangzhou province against African students, because of this allegation of predatory lending, and because of the fact that the virus originated in China. That's riled up a lot of Africans the wrong way, particularly, and created a diplomatic issue. We know that Russia, for example, plays a different game in Africa in terms of military might and energy diplomacy. So that's something to potentially leverage as well. And it's going to be interesting to see what the US does. We know that, Trump's worldview is very much shaped by what Russia and China are doing in Africa. It's a kind of them versus us initiative. And in terms of diplomacy, he's not exactly the most subtle guy, having called African countries shitholes in the past. At the moment, things like the agreement has been ratified by 30 countries is meaningless. You ask most people on the street and they don't understand what this is about, but what they want to see is a tangible and material improvement in their lives. So their ability to transact. Are the goods that they are consuming cheaper? Are they able to produce things and interact and urbanize and move up the economic prosperity ladder? That's the stuff that wins hearts and minds, and that's the stuff that you really need to catalyze. And I think this is where the role of the private sector is going to become very important, because this is not something that we can, with governments across the continent are cash strapped. They don't have the resources and the firepower to go at this alone. Civil society is very important in terms of accountability, the role of public-private partnerships, and this ultimately will be of benefit to the private sector to make Africa a production hub. So I think we really need to see a significant and active role by the private sector to champion this, because at the moment it's kind of seen as this siloed approach that's technocratic but without any real and meaningful contribution. But ultimately, if we're going to achieve this, the richer, bigger, more developed nations are going to need to carry a number of the smaller nations and the weakest in society to make this a reality.
The state and the private sector work hand in hand. I think it's critical that the state realizes that its role is to create an enabling environment, and that the private sector is there to implement.
I think it's quite clear that agriculture is the most obvious avenue, right? It's 23% of the continent's GDP. It employs about 60% of the continent's workforce. We've got arable land that's underutilized on the continent, and the potential is immense. If we combine digital elements, where we know that in Africa innovation is driven by necessity, we can really start to achieve significant outcomes. We've seen that, obviously. The example that's often quoted is M-Pesa, but there are a whole bunch of other examples where we're seeing practical innovations which have meaningful effects on people's lives and make them easier, which are catalyzed. And I think combining agriculture and technology are the low-hanging fruits, because they're the great enablers that can enable scale. And if we start, instead of simply being consumers, and start to being producers of important technologies and solve the kind of food security issue, then I think we're going to be a force to be reckoned with.
There's been a lot of focus now from a climate change perspective, and that impact on our economies as a whole. So moving away from fossil fuel to renewable energy, how is it that we fund that, and how is it that we drive that? Moving away to transition fuels such as gas, how do we develop that and how do we drive it? So I think infrastructure as a whole is going to be critical. How we fund this infrastructure is also going to be critical. So how do we tap into cheaper sources of funding and different instruments for funding for this infrastructure development?
Just looking at alternative and new ways of thinking and new economies that the continent could prioritize. I think, I've touched on the green economy. The blue economy is another area where, we've got significant coastlines. We have aquaculture, marine life, tourism is underdeveloped. All of these kind of things, the fisheries economy, all of these areas have significant potential that can be unpacked. Then in terms of the informal economy, which is something that often gets forgotten, known as the gray economy, we can formalizing those using things like fintech and thus enhancing or increasing the tax net, I think is going to be significantly important, bringing the informal sector into the formal economy. You've then also got the flat white economy, which is something I alluded to in terms of the digital technology and the fact that we've got these skills which can enable young people to take matters into their own hands. And then one of the often underexplored areas is the purple economy, which relates to the cultural economy. We've seen the rise of African cultural phenomena, Burna Boy, Trevor Noah, Lupita Nyong'o. In terms of security, I think we need to. This is rooted in issues of governance. And why do people join these entities, the Boko Harams, the Al-Shabaabs of this world? Is because they lack economic opportunities. With the right governance, with the right policies, with the right inclusive growth, with investments in soft and hard infrastructure, these people who are working and who have jobs don't have the time to join these entities. And these entities thrive when there are vacuums, when there are governance vacuums, when there are political vacuums, and when people do not have opportunities, because they offer a compelling value proposition. They capture the hearts and minds of people, and they provide them food, clothes, and shelter. And it's an alternative which is far better than what they have.
Are all things that are in some ways within our control. And I think we've agreed this afternoon that that's something that we can do in Africa. The question is, will we do it? And will we do it effectively with our partners?